Good evening, everyone. I see a few people coming in still, so you can just take a seat. Welcome, also on behalf of Studium Generale and the Green Office, who are the organizing parties of tonight's debate. My name is Margot, and I am your host tonight. For those of you who are not so familiar with Studium Generale, maybe it's your first time here. Studium Generale is a collaboration of the University of Groningen and Hanze University of Applied Sciences, and it organizes multidisciplinary events such as lectures, film screenings, and debates for broad audiences on topics related to science, culture, and society. And before we start, I would like to ask you, or if there's anyone that has objections to photos being taken, because there is someone taking photos. And if you do not want to be in them, please raise your hand now so we can take that into account. I see one hand over there. Just one. Okay, perfect. Thank you so much. So tonight we are going to look into the topic of travel, and more specifically air travel. If you think about it, we attribute a lot of great things to traveling. And just to give you an example, I looked up some nice quotes about traveling. First, travel is never a matter of money, but of courage. Second, with age comes wisdom. With travel comes understanding. And the third one I'd like to share with you is travel is the only thing that you buy that makes you richer. These are all really great things, right? And they might all be true, but we people travel more and more often, and in a lot of cases, further and further away. And in a lot of those cases, we travel by plane. And we take the plane to go to a yoga retreat, to go on a business trip, to go on a study trip maybe. And yeah, there is, unfortunately, also a downside to it, because traveling by plane is the least sustainable form of traveling you can pick. For instance, if you would take a plane from, say, Edinburgh to London, a return flight, it would contribute more CO2 than an average person would in an entire year in a country like Uganda. So recently, you might have heard about it. There's this new term that became like hot and happening, and it's called Flygskam. It came from Sweden. I might not pronounce it quite right, but it translates to flight shame. And the question remains, of course, tonight, to fly or not to fly. And that is what we are going to look into tonight with some wonderful speakers. We have 3 speakers for you who all work at the University of Groningen at different departments. And they will all talk for about 10 minutes, and they will give different perspectives on the matter. And then we will go to a panel discussion, and before the end, we would love to open up the discussion to all of you. But before we start with those presentations, I would like to see what all of your flying habits are. So I'm just going to ask you a few quick questions. Who in this room travels by plane only once a year? And I mean all flight trips, so business trips, holidays, everything counts, and we are talking about return flights. So just once a year, if you could raise your hand. Once a year? Okay, I see a few hands. And who travels by plane like 2 to 5 times a year? That's a lot more. Okay, more than 5? Quite a substantial number still. More than 10? No one, or maybe you don't dare to admit. And does anybody experience this idea of flight shame when you take a plane? Yeah, I reckon that would be about half of you. And then a big question, is there anyone in the audience that quit flying altogether? I see like 4 Brave souls. Good job, I suppose. Well, thank you very much. I think with that, we have an idea of your flying habits, and we can move on to the different perspectives on flying. So we are going to start with our first speaker. She is an environmental psychologist here at the University of Groningen. She is an assistant professor at the Faculty of Behavioral and Social Sciences. She teaches design of interventions and social aspects of sustainability. And her research is focused on interventions that could lead to sustainable behaviors. So I could think of no one better than her to talk about different motivations when it comes to our flying behaviors and the interventions that one could carry out to sort of bend our behaviors towards more sustainable ones. Ellen van der Werf.
All right, thank you very much. Good evening, everyone. Yes, I would like to go into, first of all, which behaviors are we actually talking about when you may consider more sustainable options. So first of all, what you could change, of course, is instead of flying, instead of taking the plane, you could consider a different mode of transport. So for example, if you would go on holiday to Vienna, you could take the train instead of the plane. Another option is that you actually change the location, so change the destination. So for example, instead of going on holiday to Australia, you may choose to stay in the Netherlands for your holiday. Or another option is to simply not go at all, so maybe cancel your holiday for this year. Or, and that's more relevant for business meetings, of course, business trips, you could have an online meeting. You could have a teleconference, a Skype meeting with someone instead of actually physically flying there. And depending on the alternative, depending on the sustainable behavior that could replace your flights, different factors or different motivations may play a role. So which factors are then likely to influence your behavior? Well, in general, we know from environmental psychology, when you look at sustainable behavior, there are three main factors that influence our behavior. So first of all, there's knowledge. So whether you're aware that flying causes a lot of environmental problems and whether you're aware which alternatives there are, and what your impact is. And well, we know from research this is important. You should be aware of the problem in order to change your behavior, and you should know what to do, but it's not sufficient. So providing people with information, you shouldn't expect any changes in behavior. It's important, but it won't change behavior. Then secondly, ability. This is a very crucial factor. So this is, for example, whether the infrastructure to actually travel by train to Vienna is available, or whether there's infrastructure at your company to have a proper teleconference, or the price of a train ticket compared to a plane ticket. These are all very important factors, and also factors that policymakers and practitioners can actually change. And I think you will hear more about it in the next talk as well. But I will focus mainly on the motivations that people have. And this is also a factor that actually policymakers and practitioners can influence and thereby reduce flying. And when you look at motivations, there are in general two types that influence our behavior. So on the one hand, we have motivations that focus on desirable outcomes for ourselves. So for example, money. Right? We want to buy the cheaper tickets, or we want to travel because it's very pleasurable, because it's fun. So these type of motives are important in influencing our behavior. However, this is not all. We're also motivated to do something because it's favorable for the collective. So we're also motivated to do something good, to benefit the environment, for example. And both of these type of motivations influence our behavior. However, if you then look at the sustainable alternatives I just mentioned for flying, this is often a conflict between these different motivations. So for example, well, I've had it often, but maybe you had it as well. If you have a Skype meeting with a colleague, this is not always very comfortable, right? The webcam may not work, or there may be a delay on the line. So it's maybe the good option for the environment. So it's good for the collective, but it's not per se the most pleasurable or comfortable option. Or also traveling instead of going on holiday to Australia, going on holiday in the Netherlands. This may be good for the environment, but it's not necessarily very pleasurable, right? You can end up with your tent in the rain, and maybe this also gives you less status, right? I can imagine that putting this photograph on your Instagram will maybe get less likes than when you have a nice picture of Australia on your Instagram. So a lot of these sustainable alternatives for flying are a conflict between these different types of motivations. So if we then want to promote sustainable alternatives, we should try to reduce this conflict. And one way, and also a very common way that practitioners always use or easily think about, is to make it more financially attractive to have the alternative. So one example is the tax on flying. So a couple of years ago also there was a tax on flying was introduced in the Netherlands. So the idea is, right, it's more expensive to fly and then people will be less likely to do so. However, often with financial incentives, it's not enough to change our behavior. So if you see the price difference between the train and the plane, you actually need quite a big tax in order to make the train more attractive. But also what you saw a couple of years ago is that people then fly from Germany, where the tax was not in place. So you also have to think about the possible consequences and how people can avoid this tax. And another way to reduce this conflict is to make actually the desired behavior, to make it more pleasurable, more fun. And I thought this was a really nice example from the Deutsche Bahn, the German railways. What they did is they took several international destinations, so for example Arizona in the US, and they looked for a nice alternative in the Netherlands, or in Germany, sorry. So then they presented people with the alternative close by, where they could actually travel by train and not go by plane to the US. So I have no idea how effective this intervention was, but I think it's a really nice idea to make the sustainable alternative more attractive or more pleasurable. And another option that, of course, many companies or organizations can mainly implement is to provide rules. So the University of Groningen also installed a rule that if you travel to a destination and you can actually reach it by train within 6 hours, then you're not allowed to fly anymore. You should go by train. But an important question is, how should you implement these kind of rules in order to make them as effective as possible? And I think maybe the university can learn a little bit from this study that was conducted by Nieke Lemmen, a PhD student in our group. So she collaborated with the Apelhul, the monkey zoo in the Netherlands. So that's a zoo where monkeys can walk around freely, and the monkeys can approach you, but you are not allowed to approach the monkeys actively. So you're not allowed to lure the monkeys. And together with the Apelhul, she wanted to test how can we most effectively make sure that people keep to this rule. And she had 3 alternatives. So in the first one, the control condition, it was simply presented to people, do not lure the monkeys. In the next condition, there was a sign saying, do not lure the monkeys because this is intimidating to the monkeys. So an argument was provided. And in the last condition, people were asked, why should you not lure the monkeys? And then in the zoo, she observed how many people actually obeyed the rule or violated the rule. So there's a whole procedure behind that, but the results. So what she found is that if you simply introduce the rule to people, then 17% still lures the monkeys, so they still violate the rule. However, if you provide an argument, or if you ask people why is this important, then this dropped to 7%. So this suggests that maybe the university should also make clear why they have this rule, or ask people why they think it's important, so it could be more effective. So another way to reduce this conflict between the different types of motivations people have is actually to make them focus more on their environmental motivations. So instead of making it fun or pleasurable, make these environmental motives that we also have more salient. And one way to do so is via people's past behavior. So if you remind people of past pro-environmental behavior, so for example, you ask them, do you recycle your waste? Do you switch off the lights? Then most people will say, yes, I engage in these behaviors. So then they're more likely to see themselves as a pro-environmental person, and in turn, they're more likely to act sustainably. So this promotes more pro-environmental behavior. But it also works the other way around. If you ask people, do you always buy organic products, or do you always look for the most environmentally friendly option? Then most people will say, no, I do not always do this. So actually they realize they're not always pro-environmental, their identity weakens, and then they're less likely to act sustainably. And this is also interesting from a campaign perspective, because what you often see is that campaigns make us actually aware of what we do wrong. So for example, it's emphasized that we use our car too much and that causes global warming or the rise of sea levels. Or I also really like that example that every time you take a sheet of paper, you're actually destroying the rainforest. So this is a very negative focus, right? It really focuses on what you're not doing well, while this research suggests that it's better to focus on what you are doing well because it motivates more sustainable behavior. And this is also in line with a study by Nadja Zijske, another PhD student in our group, because she looked at factors that influence whether people refrain from flying or not. And she actually found that these negative motives, such as shame, flight shame, for example, that they are weaker related to refraining from flying than more positive emotions, such as feeling pride or feeling good. So actually this whole flight shame, maybe it's better to focus on the bit more positive side. So lastly, corporate environmental responsibility. This is how pro-environmental a company is. And this is also something organizations or university who want to promote these policies to reduce flying could stress, because studies have found that the more employees realize that their company is pro-environmental, the more likely they are to act pro-environmental. So people may be more likely to follow a policy to reduce flying if they also think my company is really pro-environmental. So that could be another way to align these motives. All right, thank you for your attention.
Yeah, thank you so much. I just want to give you the opportunity to ask a question or maybe two, but not to open up the discussion just if anything was unclear to you. So are there any questions for Ellen? No? Okay, thank you so much. And we'll move on. Yeah. So we heard a little bit about what could be changed or how we can sort of look at our motivations and to change our behaviors. And I guess if you put all of our individual behaviors together, we all together sort of make up the tourism sector. And that's what we are going to hear a little bit more about next. So what good does tourism bring us and how does it relate to our flying behaviors? And we're going to do that with a man that is an assistant professor at the Faculty of Spatial Sciences, and his expertise is in, among other things, tourism geography, tourism planning, border studies, sense of place, and regional development. So please welcome Arie Stoffelen.
Good evening, and I'll start directly with a question to you. Do you have any idea how much tourism flights actually contribute to our global carbon footprint in terms of percentages? 1%. Anyone else? 1.2? You read the newspaper today?
Yes.
Yeah, all right. Good. Yeah, I think this is a very relevant question, right? I mean, the flight shame debate is, in essence, it's an emotional debate. It's a debate, it's an appeal to our emotions, it's an appeal to our ethical compass to make individual changes, to make our world a better place to live in, a more sustainable world, and we should do that through individual behavioral change. Now, while I think it is a really important thing to consider, to make sure that you have an idea that your actions actually have consequences, I think what's missing in this broader debate is a little bit of a reflection on data. Can we actually make a fundamental change by focusing on individual behavioral change alone? Yes or no? And I think this debate is something, or these kind of figures will provide a bit of context to this broader debate on flight shame. So that's my intention with this short introduction here this evening, to show a little bit of data on tourism, on the carbon footprint of tourism, so I'll answer my own question in just a minute, and I'll try to make some policy observations on that as well. So what can we learn from these figures? And I'll start with just a couple of figures on tourism itself. These figures here on the slides is the evolution of the international number of tourist arrivals. And tourism is normally defined as a person traveling abroad, so you need to cross an international border and staying there for at least one night. So that's the most basic definition of tourism. So this does not include domestic tourism in the US. This does not include domestic tourism in China, which is, of course, enormous and quite often even more than international tourist arrivals. And it also explains why Europe is in the lead here, of course, because it is more or less same size as the US, roughly speaking. But you always cross borders. In the US, you don't. Right? But if we just look at the figures, we see that from 1950 to basically now that we've more or less seen an exponential growth in tourism. And I remember very well when we breached the barrier of 1 billion international yearly tourist arrivals, and that was in 2011. Last year we reached 1.4 billion. Right, so 2011 to 2018, in 7 years' time, there were 400 million additional international tourist movements, arrivals. So that's an enormous growth in a very short amount of time. And there's several explanations for that. And the very first is that our travel behavior changes, especially in Europe. We travel more, but shorter. So the average length of stay in a certain destination now is shorter than it was 20 years ago. So that's one part of the explanation. Another explanation is growing middle classes in emerging economies, countries like China, India, Brazil, where a lot of people, much more people, have the disposable income actually to travel. Right? So you see an enormous growth there as well. And these are two explanations. But this figure is important to keep in mind also when I'll discuss the next slide. And that's the question that I first posed at the start of my talk. What is actually the contribution of tourism, and specifically tourism flights, because that's what flight chain is all about. It's about tourism flights. What's the contribution to our global carbon footprint? And luckily for me, a couple of scholars did some research on that and published it last year in Nature Climate Change, which is one of the most influential natural scientific journals out there. And what they actually found is that when we look at tourism as a whole, so the whole tourism sector, from a holistic perspective, tourism contributes to roughly 8% of our global carbon footprint in CO2 equivalents. Right, so 8% of our total carbon budget, the emissions that we make, are directly, indirectly related to tourism. And tourism is much more than just travel, right? It's more than just the mobility parts of going from country A to country B. So they also looked just purely at the travel side of things. So taking a plane, taking a car, taking a ferry, taking a cruise ship, right? And that percentage, there was 23% of this 8%, right? So roughly 1/4 of our tourism-related emissions are travel-related. And roughly 50% of these travel-related emissions are induced by airplane travel. So if we make a simple calculation, we end up with roughly 1% of our global carbon footprint that is directly related to airplane travel. So you're very right with your answer of 1%. You're roughly right as well with your 1.2, because there's a little bit of uncertainty there as well, right? But it does provide a little bit of perspective also on this flight shame debate, right? Because the flight shame debate is not about this. So tourism is about the tourist generating region, basically where you live. It's about the transit, so the travel part. But it's also about the impact that you have in the destination, where you go. So what these scholars did is they did not only look at the flight part of it, so this sustainable travel part, but they also looked, for example, at the carbon footprint of the beef curry that you had when you flew to Thailand, right? When you went to Thailand. So producing cattle is also has an environmental impact. So that was also included in the study. And this flight shame debate only focuses on one element of the whole tourism sector. And this 1% of the total carbon budget or carbon emissions that we have is not that much, to be honest. On the one hand, it is much because we're only talking about one individual action, right? It's stepping into a plane and exiting the plane. So that's a lot. But if we focus on the flight shame debate, and we're purely focusing on flight shame, we would potentially reduce our number of flights by 5%, which would be an enormous success. Right, especially considering the exponential growth of tourism that we've seen. We would lower our carbon emissions by 5% or 1%. So I just want to show that we need a little bit more than just a focus on the individual. Right? I think this focus on individual responsibility is important on the one hand. Right? If you do not have any kind of actions from people to pressure governments, for example, to take actions. There's no incentive to doing so. Right? But just with focusing on individual responsibility, individual behavioral change, we will simply not get there in terms of carbon emissions. An important thing to notice as well is that our technological improvements to make our travel behavior greener, more sustainable, they at the moment cannot keep up with the growth of tourism. So tourism grows more rapidly than that we actually can deal with in terms of greening of the industry. So with electric flying, with hydrogen power, etc., etc. So tourism's contribution is only going to increase. Now we've only talked about the environmental side of sustainability, of course, right? Sustainability is more than just the environmental side. So tourism is also being noted for economic and cultural change as well. So if we all of a sudden ban flights from Western Europe to Kenya, to Nairobi, or to Kampala in Uganda, a lot of people who are actually very much dependent on their livelihood would also lose their livelihood, right? Would struggle to make ends meet. How can we compare these different things? It makes the whole discussion on sustainability and tourism quite difficult. Now, to end my story, I'll stick a little bit to this responsibility question, because, yes, I think it is a very good evolution that people are aware now that a 15-euro return flight to Barcelona is maybe not the best option, right? If we asked that question 10 or 15 years ago, people would say, oh, yeah, that's a good deal. Now a lot of people would scratch their heads and say, like, how is this even possible? Right? So I think there is an important role for this kind of individual behavioral change. But the scale of change that we need, we simply cannot achieve that with focusing on individual behavioral change alone. It should be one of the elements, one of the elements in a broader policy plan. Right? We do not just simply, international cooperation is not simply wanted, it's something that we actively need to do. Because otherwise you'd end up with the situations just sketched to you that people would just move to Germany to take their airplane, right? We need a European level cooperation, a European level taxes, European level investments in other and cleaner technologies, in alternative modes of transportation that are much more sustainable, just simply to create this kind of the impact that we need on this higher scale that you cannot achieve with individual actions alone. So I'll end there. Thank you.
Thank you. Again, are there any questions that you have that you are not quite clear about what Arik was saying? So clarifying questions, so to speak. No? Okay. Thank you so much. So from these questions about responsibility, we are going to move towards some ethical perspectives. And this is with our last speaker, who is a local politician, and his trade, so to speak, is in philosophy. He has a master's degree in applied ethics, so maybe he's the one to ask whether you should fly or not. He's also a study advisor at the Honors College and the coordinator of the Knowledge Center of Philosophy. Nick Nieuwenhuizen.
Let me see. Yeah, it's working. Okay, yes. Hello, everyone. My name is Nick, indeed, and I'm an ethicist. That sounds a bit dirty if you say it like that, and being a local politician might be even worse. So I'm indeed not going to tell you I've decided to, at least as an ethicist or wannabe ethicist, not decide to tell you what's the right or wrong thing to do. Instead, I just want to take you with me on a very ethics 101 kind of trip, in which I will discuss some basic principles, and then you can have all the weapons in your hands in the discussions that you might have, or at least some weapons concerning Flygskam, or the shame of flying. But before I start with that, I have a question for you. Many of you know Star Trek? Fingers, please. Hands. Star Trek? Yeah, I've seen some Star Trek, okay. And who many of you do know Star Trek Voyager? Okay, yeah, also some very, very lucky people there. Yeah, Star Trek Voyager was a techie, to be honest, techie series that was sent out in the 90s, or broadcast in the 90s. And I've watched it first when I was about 10 or 11 years old. And this series really took me away in imagining the unimaginable and traveling towards everything that we ever wanted. And there was with this, well, very sexy crew, and this crew was flying in this ship, which could fly with warp 9.975 in top speed, which was about roughly 2 billion kilometers per second, which is quite fast. And they had a problem because, I don't know if the laser is working. Yeah, it is even. You are here now, like in the sun. That's where we are, this point. And due to anomaly, which is a lot common in Star Trek, they were transferred to this part of the galaxy. This is our Milky Way, by the way. And that was about 75,000 light years away. And even in their pace, it would take about 70 years to get back to Earth, if they could manage to not, of course, be destroyed by all the hazards. So it all took place, or it's taking place maybe in 2371, and it is exciting. It is romantic. Like, you don't know what will happen, and you don't know what you will face. It's of course daring, like the explorers that we had, who sailed across the Earth and didn't see any land, and just were on the waves. Limitless, everything is possible. You can see everything. It was the pinnacle, or let's say Star Trek is a pinnacle of human achievement, in the sense that we could convert energy into mass, and everything was clean. It was very, very clean. And we could go boldly where no man has ever gone before. So that was then, but here we are now, right? In 2019, atmospheric flight is the best we have. Also exciting, you're going to new places, seeing things you've never seen before. It is romantic in the sense that you can leave everything behind you and just go. It is daring in a sense. There's not only Flygskam, but also fear of flight, of course, I guess, still. And I find it very, if I fly, it's very cool how you lift off and the engine is going. It is limitless in a sense. You can discover every part of the world and go in 50 hours around the world. Also a pinnacle of human achievement. If you see the Concorde, which is not flying anymore, of course, but still, it is quite some thing forward and human technology. But it is everything but clean, of course, as we've heard. And the numbers, I'm not going to repeat the numbers, maybe as a politician later in discussion, but it is a very unsustainable way of moving forward. But it is, or it might be, the way towards that utopian Star Trek civilization that I fancy, to be very honest. Why am I telling all this? Well, to show you that link between that romantic idea of what I thought would also be the very, well, pinnacle of what we are as humans, but as we now see, it is something that has some questions in it. So what we're going to do, or we have the dilemma of some kind of neophilia versus a harming principle. The love that Homo sapiens and humans have for the new, everything that's new and that's unknown and that we want to discover, versus harming principle, a very simple principle in which you talk about everything you destroy or harm on your way, which we also do as humans and Homo sapiens. So the core moral question would be, is it morally wrong to fly? And to get a sense of what the answers on that question could be, I have three very basic ethical principles that I will now introduce to you, and maybe you know them already. Deontological ethics, virtue ethics, and consequentialist ethics. And all those principles give different, or can give different answers to these questions. So let's start with deontological ethics. An act, in deontological ethics, the act itself is most important. So the goodness of the act. So who's doing the act doesn't matter, what the results are doesn't matter, it's the act itself that counts. Certain rules or principles are behind that act, and from that act follow various moral duties. So you should do this or that, or you shouldn't do this or that. A very famous deontologist was Kant, Immanuel Kant, in the 17th and 18th century. And he introduced also fairness and justice, which were very important principles in his matter. And he had a principle of universality, and act only according to that maxim whereby you can at the same time will that it should become a universal law. Well, a maxim is a certain moral code that you have, or a moral principle. So this could also be translated in what if everyone would live like you? And that's, of course, an interesting idea if we talk about air travel. So if we translate it to this question, do I have a moral duty to not fly? Well, what if everyone was flying this much? Would that be fair? Would it be just? And would it be rational? So if we answer those questions, it could be, yes, I have a moral duty to not fly because there is no world thinkable in which everyone would fly in the amounts that we do now. It would, you know, there would be too many planes in the air. There would be too much pollution. There was too much fijnstof. I'm not sure what the translation is in English. Sorry? Particular matter. Thank you. Oh, this almost sounds like Star Trek. So is it the world that you can imagine? Would Kant ask? Would it be fair to ourselves and our environment to do it? Might it be unjust in terms of the harms that is done to others while you're just flying away? And it could be, in a sense, irrational. So that could be an answer from a deontological perspective. Virtue ethics is more based on the individual performing, like the individual that is performing the act. That's important. It's about the character of that person and the intentions, the context. You know, why are you flying? What are you going to do? The virtues that virtues give you an idea, a sense of richting is, of course, direction. Thank you. You know, what's a good life? What is it to live a good life and to be a good person? That's important. Aristotle, eudaimonia, happiness, well-being, those were very important things for an individual to strive after. And the principle could be an act is morally right just because it is one that a virtuous person acting in character would do in that situation. So you might already think about what would, of course, I was now going, yeah. What would Jesus do, for instance, if you have a virtuous character? It could be that for some people, I think even a lot of people in the world, Jesus is a very virtuous character. So what would a virtuous character do? What would his or her action be? So would a person with a virtuous character fly? What are his or her intentions? What is the context? Is he or she going just to go away, or is it because you want to visit a ill family member, or to save a lot of people? What are the relevant virtues? You need some courage, right, to explore, to go where you boldly no one has ever gone before. Temperance is important, and modesty. Is it and the other way around? Is it necessary for you to go to place A or B? So, and lastly, we have consequential ethics. I really need to make some speed, even more. Sorry for that, light speed. The result of an act is most important. We're looking for the outcome of an act, which certain rules or principles could also be underlying. Moral duties are important. So, because an act is good, you should do it or should not do it. And well-being is most important. So, this principle. An action is morally right if and only if it does more to improve overall well-being than any other action you could have done in the circumstances. So it's really looking to the results, and of course, the trolley experiment, which is very famous. You just, if the trolley is going for that one person, you should go for that handle because then you save 4 lives netto. So do I have a duty? Well, the overall well-being should be checked, and you should make a balance from yourself. And here you have, of course, it could be either way, depending on the discussion about the numbers, for instance, and discussion about other things that are important in this way. So, concludingly, I'm also almost there. In the deontological ethics, the act is most important and is most central. In the virtue ethics, the character is very important. Does flying contribute to the good life, for instance, could be a question. And in consequentialist ethics, does flying promote or harm our overall well-being, which is a discussion. And I would like to conclude, I think, with an idea of Hannah Arendt. which is maybe nice in this sense that she stated, if we want to give meaning to our lives, we always need a communal meaning. That's the only way the people that were before us and the people that are becoming after us are the ones that give meaning to our life, and that is the reason why we need to be protective of that communal world. And thus, I would say, in the words of Captain Kirk, hit it and engage, and thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Nick. I'm going to do the same as I did with the other two. Are there any questions to clarify anything for Nick? Yeah, I see one person over there, and I have someone who will come to you with a microphone so everyone can hear you.
What's the question?
Somewhere over there. Can you raise? Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you for the presentation, but I was wondering if you personally distinguish between the different types of ethics in which you personally maybe view as being more important or more relevant, maybe.
Oh, yeah, we have a microphone.
I was afraid this question would come. Now maybe the politician in me starts, so this could be a good way to open the debate. I think that actually that virtue ethics is a little bit of a form of ethics that's a bit forgotten. We are very stringent and very streng, very judgmental also of ourselves and of each other. And in the virtue ethics, that still can be judgmental, but the viewing of the whole context and taking the time to talk about the whole context and the character, the intentions of someone might be worth of taking a better look at that form of ethics. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you very much. So now I would like to invite all of the speakers back on the stage for a discussion on your perspectives. Yeah. So I think we are still audible. Yes. All right, so we heard some different perspectives. First, we started with some of the things you could do to change your individual behaviors. Then you told us a little bit about what actually is the impact of the tourism sector and the flying sector on the problem of climate change and stuff like that. And then you went on to how can you look at this from an ethical perspective. Now, first, I would like to zoom in a little bit on the individual actions versus systemic actions, because, Ellen, you talked to us about more individually focused measures, and then we heard that is just 1% that, of the global impact comes from flying. So I was wondering, how do you look at this from your perspective?
Yeah, so I think indeed it's a part of the solution, but it's still an important solution. So I mentioned also our behavior. So I think to reduce environmental problems, we need to change our behavior, and not just flying, but a whole range of behaviors. Mm-hmm. And then, of course, the focus should be also on the individual. How can we motivate people to change their behavior? But indeed, there's that's also the ability part that I mentioned briefly in the beginning. I think from a policy perspective, it is really important that you try to enable people to act more sustainably. So make sure that the infrastructure is there, or make sure that the price you pay for sustainable travel is more affordable. So I think it's important to also focus on the individual, but I think we should, especially by now, in order to combat these problems, we should focus on all aspects.
Okay. And can I ask you how you look at that? Because from what you said, you might conclude, well, maybe we should just all, take our flights and not worry about it. But how do you look at it? Do you feel there is a sense of purpose in the individual actions as well? Or
What was totally not my purpose, or the purpose of my short talk, to say like, let's do whatever you want.
That's why I say you might.
Yeah. No, well, I think the focus on the individual responsibility can cut two ways. So on the one hand, yes, I think it's very important to create this level of awareness out there, that there is this critical mass, so that policy can act upon that. So that, and then again, you come back that it enables people to live more sustainably themselves. I think the danger is there in that we just say, yeah, okay, it's your individual responsibility, so you should take actions first, and then if you don't do it, you don't have anything to say about how policy works. Right? So you basically hide behind the fact that it's an individual responsibility, and I think that is a really wrong way to go. Because then if you just simply look at the numbers, then you can just say, well, if we only focus on that, if we basically hide behind this argument that it should be individual change alone, and that should be the main driver, then we simply won't have enough impact. I think it's very important to have this individual behavioral change, but also as a way to stimulate policy to bring this to the next level, to a higher scale. Because only then you can have fundamental changes. We need a systemic change in a way, and I think systemic change cannot be achieved only with individual actions. I think individual actions are an important part of that, to kickstart the whole process, to make sure there is critical mass, but it's not enough.
Okay. And then I come to you. There's a nice bridge there, because how do you look at this from a policy perspective or a political perspective?
Oh yeah. Oh, first. Well, I do want to add something in a more about the ethical perspective, and then I can maybe come to the policy perspective. Because what I found important, and also what Ellen is saying, is that we don't want to be destroying assholes most of the time, right? So we don't want to be people who destroy our environment or each other, or in a general sense at least. But we are doing that, and that's why I think maybe there's a paradox, because you can plea for a certain softness, because we're all in this together, and we're all like. Only living is enough already to occupy a space that someone else can't occupy. But at the other hand, we could also sometimes maybe be a bit more taking accountable and taking responsibility as an individual. And there's a gradation. A grading between those two. Yeah.
Okay. So technically, you're saying we need to do both. Or
yeah, well, at least we need to have...
summarizing, right?
Yeah, we need to have... we have both perspectives are important. Both views, I think, towards how we're acting as humans.
Okay.
In this debate.
Where I think that is very important is the fact that climate change is a long-term thing, right? So we at the moment don't really feel it. Perhaps that we don't have this skating competition every winter anymore, right? The Elfstedentocht, something like that. But it's not something pressing at the moment for us. But I think a very important ethical aspect there is as well that those who pollute most, so mostly the richer countries, are also those who feel the least of the consequences in the long run, right? So it's the people who pollute less who will have the most direct impact, at least in the short run. So I'm talking about the global south for a large part, but also within our own society in heat waves. It's in general the people who cannot afford to insulate their houses the best, etc. So being aware of that, then we're very much on an individual level. We're very much on an ethical question as well. Right, so this awareness for me is also about awareness of the ethical implications of your own decisions, of your own actions.
Yeah.
So that's where I think that this reflection on the ethics side is important as an awareness part. But changing the system fundamentally is more than just that.
Yeah. And what is it more?
Well, they need systemic change, and the systemic change is not something that you do on an individual level. You need international cooperation for that. So it's policy taking responsibility, but on as high level as possible. Because otherwise, I mean, for example, think about flight taxes. If one country implements flight taxes and kerosene taxes, then another country doesn't. Then planes will just land over there, and people will leave from that particular place. So nothing will change. You just get a different spatial distribution of the whole phenomenon. If you do that on a larger level, on a European level, then all of a sudden you create a backstop, right? You create a situation that the traveler cannot avoid. You create a situation that the airline companies cannot avoid. So then we're really all in it together. right? And then you have this broader systemic change, or can lead to a broader systemic change.
And do you have an idea of what is necessary to bring about the systemic changes? I'm basically asking all of you. What would you think is...
Well, I think that is very important. That indeed a government limits sometimes the desires that we have in a certain sense, because we indeed as individuals cannot foresee, as Ari mentioned, cannot foresee how big the consequences are on a bigger scale, and thus you need cooperation and the democracy actually. I hope that democracy can win this fierce battle, because it is quite hard to vote against your own desires. But yeah, that a government is able to limit what we can do in a certain sense.
But I think there's also sometimes a little bit of an underestimation from politicians how much people actually are willing to sort of suffer a little bit for the better, right? So several studies show that in different countries people do care about the environment and they are willing to do something, right? For example, a simple example, most of us will recycle their waste. Well, you know, this is not very rational. It's a hassle, you need different bins, it's a little bit of a mess, but we still do it anyway because we think it's the right thing to do, and that is the case for many different behaviors. So also politicians could, instead of saying, oh, people are not willing to do so, just be a bit more brave and actually help people to act in line with what they want, and not make right at the moment the flying tickets are so much more cheaper than the train tickets, for example. So now it's completely the other way around, that people are sort of almost forced, maybe in some cases, to not act in line with. So we should, or politics should be more brave to put higher taxes on flying tickets, for example, or maybe you should be even more extreme and say we need to somehow find a way to limit the number of flights that people are taking. Yeah, I think they should be less afraid of the consequences, that people will have a complete rise against it or something.
And also that's maybe in a bigger idea of mobility, like how are you going to offer mobility to people in a way that is maybe indeed not as comfortable as your own limousine or BMW with 250 kilometers on the freeway, but is still in let's say in the neighborhood of that comfort zone, and provides mobility in a more sustainable way. So that's where governance also comes in, of course, to promote and stimulate that.
I think it's also difficult about this question that we're in a little bit of a chicken or the egg situation, right? So do we want government to be more proactive? Now, government will be more proactive if they notice that a lot of people will actually support that kind of stuff, right? So where I think that, for example, this flight shame debate makes a lot of sense is to create symbolism. It's a symbolic movement as well, right? So just purely on the climatological effects of this flight shame debate, that's very limited. But it is a very symbolic effect to basically say to policymakers, hey, hold on, and to economic actors, hold on, this is something that we do not accept anymore. So that hopefully this chicken or the egg situation gets solved a little bit, and more proactive stances from governments will actually be facilitated that way.
There is one thing to add to that, I think, or to contrast you a bit, because I would say that if we don't take another look at flying, for instance, then we are, of course, checking a projection of enormous growth of flying, right? And then that footprint might increase even a whole lot of percentages, and so that's also, I think, a reason why now is a good time to ask ourselves, hey, do we really need this and this often?
Yeah. I'm quite curious, who here in the room thinks it's a good idea that we put limits on, say, flying from our, that our governments put a limit on it? Can you?
Yeah. More or less.
Okay.
Quite a lot.
Quite a lot.
Maybe this is not very representative
of
the whole.
That's the question, if it's a representative crowd or not. But
it is in line with studies showing that most people are willing
Yeah.
to give up
That's
something.
what you find in other studies as well.
Yeah.
Okay. All right. So I think we can open up our discussion to the audience as well. So please, if you have any questions for either of the speakers. Yeah. I see quite. Let's start here at the front.
Yeah, I wonder if we ask the right question if we ask someone, do you want to fly less? They asked the Dutch population, 70% is quite content with the flying. So 70% of our population. If you ask someone, do you want that your grandchildren can still live here? They say, yes, of course. These two questions, they don't match. Because one way you say, I want to keep flying, and the other way around, you say, I want my grandchildren to have a living in Holland. That's not possible in the way we are living now. Sea levels are rising, and they are rising so fast that if we don't act in 100 years, we are below sea level in Holland. Yeah. So I think we should focus far more, also in the communication in our papers, on a very black future if you don't act on a lot of scales, because flying is only 1%. Eh?
Do you have a question for one of the speakers?
No, yeah, I think that we should more focus, but that's the question also on the speakers. Do you agree that we should more focus in for the politics and for the papers, for the media,
okay,
that for this black future idea? So come on,
give a realistic perspective. Can I say it like that? So maybe it's nice to start with you, Alan, because you have...
If I listen, for example, if I listen to Trump, if I listen to Baudet, I hear only one thing, and that is après nous le déluge. Mm-hmm. You know, we live now and fuck the future. Yeah. That is what they say. Okay. You know? So and here are a lot of young people. I think they have another idea about that.
Yes, I think the question is clear. So should we focus more on a black future, as you say? So I'd like to start with you.
Yeah, I think you're very right that indeed often when we make such choices, we now maybe do not consider the consequences. People just think, oh, it's a nice weekend in Barcelona, for example. But also what I was saying in the beginning of my talk, that often information alone, so the fact that your behavior has negative consequences for the future is not enough to change behavior. So I think this is very important, that we should make people aware of it, and I think this is more and more the case, but I think we need more to actually change people's behavior.
Mm-hmm. Would you like to?
Yeah, well, to be honest, I need to protect myself sometimes a bit against climate depression almost, or not misogyny, but misanthropy, like hating humanity and hating what we are doing. Especially as a politician, you need to be careful with those, with what you're saying. But so I actually, you know, I began that talk with my like utopia that might be Star Trek and a world without money and everything is possible and etc. And that's also a black, in a certain sense, a black future. But like the idea of that optimism is a duty from Popper, I believe, is still something that really attracts me, and I hope that I can stay optimistic and that we find a way to both fill some of the desires that we have and have a world that will still go on. Yeah. So yeah. Sorry.
Okay. And there were a few more questions. Let's go over there.
Yes, thanks so far for the discussion. I'm, by the way, Stefano, a student at the Faculty of Spatial Sciences. I was wondering, can you maybe tell a little bit more about the positive impact of flying? For example, our fly behavior impacts third world economies quite positively. And for example, I went myself to Sri Lanka and Nigeria, and the environments I saw there, they really let rethink sustainability, for example. So I was wondering, could you maybe elaborate a little bit more about these positive impacts, about learning about other places in the world and our impacts over there?
I think that question is for you.
So there are several ways of looking at things. So if you're talking about cultural aspects, about intercultural exchange, getting to know each other, creating respect for each other, etc., etc. So that's one part of the equation, of course. We're also very much talking, especially in developing countries or the global south, very much on an economic perspective as well. And we're not only talking about the economic effects of flying, of course, but just of the tourism sector. And what you in general see is that developing countries have very high percentages of their GDP, so the gross domestic product, is related to tourism. So in many of these countries, roughly 10% of their economy basically is centered on tourism, which is significant. But I think that's also still not the main question that we need to answer, or the main topic that we should highlight when focusing on sustainability and tourism in the global south, because I think we should focus there more on a livelihood basis, right? Because in many of these places, tourism is one of the sole income generators. So tourism is very important in order to basically for people to make ends meet. But that's also quite often where the positive part of the story ends. Because the tourism sector is also a bit notorious in a way, also from an economic perspective. Because quite often, the terms of employment in the tourism sector are very bad. Wage levels are very bad, also in developing countries. Growth opportunities are also not very good. So basically, if you're an employee in an international hotel chain and in Sri Lanka or in South Africa or wherever, the opportunities to actually make a career out of that sector, out of that employment, are also very limited. But so I've done some research in South Africa where you actually see that people have two options. They either go and work for a five-star hotel chain, or they go and work in the mines, 2 kilometers below ground. And a lot of people choose for the mines. Yes, they may die, but the terms of employment for the rest are a lot better. So they have health insurance, they have better wages. If they can make enough money in 10 years in the mine compared to 40 years in the tourism sector. There is also some positive effects on tourism there as well, and that's mostly in terms of learning and skills creation, right? So creating skills in the tourism sector that you can transfer to other economic sectors and use that basically to empower yourselves. Because quite often, especially in the global south, these power relations between international tour operators, hotel chains, and the local people are not that positive. It has to be said, though, that a lot of people are simply dependent on the sector. It's not the perfect sector for economic sustainability purposes in the global south, but the reality is that a lot of people are, in fact, dependent on that. So simply saying, okay, yeah, let's stop flying to these countries, it will create a lot of problems for a lot of people on a daily basis, even though potentially all alternative sectors could be better for development of these places.
So I was wondering, because you're saying that, correct me if I'm wrong, I'm just summarizing. So a lot of times the people that work in tourism don't necessarily get great benefits, but they are sort of dependent on it. And if we stop flying there will be economic consequences there as well. Yeah. And I was wondering, from an ethical point of view, what your take on that is.
Yeah, the balancing between indeed weighing the pros and the cons. It's difficult because you could also say that, you know, if a country is forced to withdraw in their tourism enterprises because nobody's coming anymore, then it might take another path after some big crisis, but another path to a more sustainable way or other means of keeping the head above water. But I'm not a sociologist, or so it's difficult for me to say something about that in that sense. But it is a real question to ask, and a good question to ask. How nice is that life in tourism? Mm-hmm. So yeah.
Okay.
It's a bit of a difficult thing, right? So I heard this of this experiment of this one professor from one of the Ivy League universities in the US who just went to his classes barefoot because he said, I don't want to wear Nikes or Adidas trainers to my class because they're the result of child labor, etc. in Vietnam and these countries. But then the question was, well, if we don't buy shoes anymore, I mean, a lot of these people would not have any income at all, and that's also not ethical. In a way, right? So this is a little bit of, it's a very difficult sector to, or just in general, a difficult set of questions to also answer from an ethical perspective, because you're balancing positive and negative sides that you can't really compare to each other.
Yeah, it's tricky. There are a lot of other questions. Let's go, I saw you at the corner of my eye, or not anymore. Yeah.
I have a bit of a sub-question.
Wait a second, because the microphone will get over here, so everyone can hear you.
I had a bit of a sub-question to one of the first questions asked, but I think especially for you, how important, because you said information is not the most important incentive by itself. I was wondering if any of you know how important the price point would be in changing the behavior in flying, because intuitively, and this is totally not scientific, I feel like the price point has become so important. So also for making informed policy decisions, do you know of any research, or do you have anything to elaborate on to say if changing the price drastically, would that maybe solve a lot of the maybe short to mid flights?
Yes, I think in general research shows that financial incentives are often not effective because they're not worth the effort. So for example, in the domain of energy consumption, if you focus on the financial savings, if you save energy, then it's really, right, you realize, oh, it's a lot of hassle to save energy, but I may save a few euros a month. So often it's not worth the effort. And I think also with the flight tax, right, it's such a low amount compared to the rest that's not effective. However, at the moment, I think the price difference between flying and other modes of transport can be so high that these financial aspects can really be a barrier to choose a different mode of transport. So I think at the moment the financial aspect is important, but it's also important to keep in mind that often financial incentives are not motivating or not enough to
because the gap is so extreme.
Yeah, or that's right, if you have a flight tax of €9 per ticket, that's not really enough. So it should be really worth the effort. So it should be a very big motivating financial incentive, and otherwise, you may better focus on other aspects.
Yeah, I think we should do this kind of taxes and levying taxes and that kind of stuff along the whole line. So we should do this kerosene tax, we should do a ticket tax, and it's to change individuals' behavior, but it's also to actually generate money that we can invest in alternative modes of transportation. So it's both behavioral change, and maybe that's limited, but there's also money to be made that way, right? And with that money, we can create alternatives that are more sustainable, and we can, because at the moment there's simply an unfair competition, right? Because we subsidize airplanes. We basically subsidize them by not asking any taxes for that, or hardly any, compared to other greener modes of transportation.
Or investing in air stations, airfields.
Airports?
Airports. Yeah, thank you.
Well, maybe we can talk about that a little bit, because we have an airport here in Groningen, of course, and one in Schiphol that you might all know. So what about these airports? Should they be able to grow unlimited, or how should we look at this?
I think what we know also from research on road infrastructure, for example. So often people say, right, if there's a traffic jam, we should simply build more roads, so that reduces the traffic jams. But studies over and over show that actually if you increase the number of roads or the number of lanes, then for maybe a very short time, the traffic jams will reduce, but then it simply increases demand. More people realize, oh, I can now travel fast, so they will use it more. And the same will probably hold for airports. If it's easier for you to fly, and if it then maybe even becomes cheaper as well to fly, then this will simply increase demand. And I guess, well, we can conclude by now that that's not necessarily what we want.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. And What,
yeah.
I mean, let's say we talk about Groningen because it's very close. Should Eelde be able to grow, and how far?
Yeah, well, the point is that Eelde isn't growing at all, so it's on a money infuse, like it gets subsidy from not any longer, but from local and national governments, and so it cannot run on its own. And then people say, yeah, but if you give it a little bit more time and a little bit more money, then it will grow on itself. And because Groningen very much needs that airfield, I think Groningen needs a good connection to Schiphol, obviously. Maybe not too good, because then we would fly maybe even more. But okay, no, I think that Eelde is truly something that maybe if you want to go parachute jumping, then you go to Eelde, but not for commercial flights to what is it, Berlin, also in Copenhagen, and it's not a good idea.
We have these heated debates on whether or not we should develop Eelde. We have heated debates whether or not Lelystad should be the second hub of Schiphol. We don't really have the similar kind of heated debates on whether or not we should invest public money in similar high quality, high speed train lines, right? And in both cases, it's public money being pumped into an infrastructure, into a mobility infrastructure project. So I think we should also make a decision there. What kind of mobility do we want in the future? And public money is only limited, so we should focus on the kind of things that we want in the future, in a long-term perspective, because these investments, they're massive in terms of, that's a serious budget going to a single kind of infrastructure project. So, well, choose smartly, I would say.
We do get the connection to Bremen now. That will be faster, right? So there.
Yeah. But it's for me, stuff like that needs to be done also on a European level, right? If you just leave this on a bilateral level, then you'll just get these individual kind of actions. And one train line to Bremen, it's a good development, but that's not sufficient. Right, and in the meantime, you still get this. But we need the second hub of Schiphol, because otherwise people would go to Germany, would fly to Germany, and then there's more economic opportunities in Germany. So it's always looking at what the other does, right, instead of acting collectively.
And do you think, for example, the EU, like you talk about, has the capacity to pull this off?
It definitely has the capacity, but the willingness should be there as well. The capacity is there. It should be there. That's the whole role of the European Union. I'm not only talking about mobility. I'm also talking about energy grids, right? It's a similar kind of discussion. That's also something that you cannot solve on an individual municipal level. It's something that you need to do on a European level. So definitely the European Union has the capacity, but the willingness to act is something else.
Okay. So, and why would you think it's not happening now? Because they're not willing, or is there something else, maybe?
I think we're back to the discussion that we had before, right? On who's taking proactive stances there. Is our government? Well, that's two things. Are they actually daring to take an opportunity? But there's also geopolitics involved, of course, and national identities being involved. So it's not just purely a rational discussion. It's also about who are we as citizens in our globalizing world? And I think that also creates quite a lot of hesitance among a lot of people to cooperate. Because but if we cooperate more, then maybe we lose our sense of self-identity in a way as well. So I think it's more than just this kind of purely rational discussion on how we should solve this story or this issue.
Quite complicated. Okay, let's take a question from here.
Yes. Hello. First, thank you for coming in this whole discussion. I agree with you about that maybe we should have more taxes on flights and stuff. But I was wondering whether you think maybe this would have a bigger impact on the less wealthy part of the population, because maybe it's a family who can now afford to go to Portugal for a holiday only once in a year because flights are cheaper, and they pollute less than businessmen and women who travel once a week on flights. And I think these taxes will have a lot of impact on them. I think we saw that also in France when they tried to implement tax on gas, and the whole yellow jacket movement started, because this tax had a bigger impact on the people that already are not wealthy enough to live in a city, so they have to live outside the city. They need their car every day to travel, and this had more impact on them than on richer people who are polluting more, and that doesn't really matter to them. So I wanted maybe more ethic question. But.
Yeah. It is a very difficult question, but also a very important one. The idea of climate justice and the idea of how can we distribute the scarce grondstoffen. Sources, of course, which are left, and like you could say that the carbon oxide is also like a source that we have only limited amount of, and it is a question that we need to ask each other much more. Like I sometimes have that more blackish feeling of, we cannot have. Not every one of us can have everything. That's ridiculous, and we are totally living on a reserve time, and this is not possible. But it's easy to say from a privileged position. It's as easy as that. So you need to think about how can you indeed make a fair division of what we have left.
Yeah, I think also to a certain extent it's what you're also saying, that actually those who are currently flying the most or using the most energy to heat their house, for example, are the wealthier people. So these kind of measures will also hit them most, and maybe they can afford it better. But then it's of course still a political decision if you maybe want to distribute that money differently. But in principle, they hit them the hardest, the wealthy people. So that in that sense, it's also, you could see it as fair.
So when we talk about systemic change, it's more than just taxes on one thing, right? So the Yellow Jacket movement, for example, yes, it hits poor people more than others, but that's also because there's no alternative, right? So I think there is also a responsibility for policymakers there if they make these kind of decisions. I mean, for me, it's not, you don't have a right to fly. It's not like a human right to fly, right? I think you do have a bit of a right to be mobile. And I think those are two totally different things, because there are also alternative ways of transportation. And what you have in France, which is a very centralized country, you see that particularly the rural areas, that's where a lot of the poorer people live. So they are more dependent on their cars as well, because there's no public transportation system that's actually financially feasible or financially viable in its own right. So they decide, well, I mean, in a lot of places, the public transportation systems are cut because they're not financially viable. But then the question is, like, if you actually... or for me, the solution would be to make sure that you get extra money because you tax gasoline higher, to a higher degree, then you actually invest that in a way so that people who are hit by that are actually have alternatives to still be mobile in a certain way. Right, so for me, it's also not like you don't have a right to own a car. You have a right to be mobile. You don't have the right to fly across the world. You have the right to be mobile in a way that actually make sure that you fulfill your needs and that you have plenty of opportunities in economic and social way. Right? That doesn't limit yourself to, but don't limit yourself to one particular mode of transportation, because I think it's not going. Yeah, we're not going to solve things that way.
Yeah. And it's also the other way around, right? Like in cities, it's really swamped with cars more and more, and that's becoming such a bigger problem that those people also have the right to be mobile, but then that means that their car cannot be in the city anymore, at least not in the inner city.
Yeah, it's a similar discussion.
Yeah.
Okay, more questions? Okay, let's go over there.
I forgot your name on my left side. You spoke about systemic changes, that not only individual changes are necessary, but systemic changes as well. But so we're seeing now that flight shaming is becoming more of a thing in the Western world, at least. But I'm wondering, do you think it's big enough of a thing to actually make policy changes happening? Like, does enough of the population think so? And also with regards to other parts of the world, maybe Asia and South America or developing countries, do you think it will ever be enough of an issue for enough people to actually make systemic policy changes?
I think it's part of a broader movement, right? So you see, climate protest, you see flight shame, you see all these different kind of actions. And I think at a certain point there will be a critical mass there, at least to slowly but steadily change also policy in a way. And what I think is very dangerous is to basically say like, yeah, but they're flying in China as well, right? So basically saying we're doing very bad, but look at our neighbor, he's doing even worse. So, I mean, he should change, we shouldn't. No, someone needs to take the lead there as well. right? So I think at a certain moment, in Western Europe, we're one of the most affluent areas in the world. We have not a lot of unemployment. Of course, we have some social and economic issues as well, but on a global scale, they're relatively limited, right? So there's plenty of economic surplus, there's plenty of technological improvements going on. Why not take the lead in this kind of thing? And there's plenty of citizen protest now as well. So I think this kind of critical mass is slowly but steadily growing. And at a certain moment, we just need to take the lead here and not saying, yeah, but in Brazil or yeah, in China, they're doing even worse than we, and use that as an excuse to not act ourselves. I think that's a folly. I think that's a way we're never going to solve any issues. Yeah, I don't know if you could.
Yeah, well, it's also it is a focus on the numbers, right? We have a lot of those arguments, like the 1.2 billion in India and 1.4 in China, or the other way around. But people rising in the middle class, wanting everything, wanting their refrigerators, aircos, etc. But still, their global footprint per capita isn't even comparable at the little, or is very incomparable with ours. So we really need to take a look at ourselves in how in what we're doing. And I fully agree with Ari that this is a moment in which you really can make a change and show where you're going, because obviously, not only the Netherlands will have big problems maybe in 100 or 200 years, or even maybe earlier with regards to that we're under the sea level, but there will be areas also in India and in South America which will be maybe unlivable due to climate change. So that's also why you need to be in the front.
Is there anything you think that we, all of us as individuals, could do to help bring about this systemic change that we talk about?
Ellen. I have to solve it. Well, I think what you already see at the moment, right? What I said, that's often people are more willing to actually do something to reduce environmental problems than maybe some politicians are aware of. So to make this clear, and I think you see it also now in the protests, for example, but you can also, then of course you also come to individual behaviors you can engage in. But if I would have the solution, then no, unfortunately.
$1 million.
Okay, so no, okay. Maybe we have time for, I think, one last question. Who's the lucky person? Over there with the red shirt.
Red shirt.
Hi, I have a question to Ellen because it's a psychological question. In my wider family, I have relatives that I would call climate deniers. So they would not accept policies or systemic change, so they would not support this right now. But for me, very unexpectedly, they are very much convinced of the plastic pollution problem. And I wonder what's the reason for that? Is there a psychological difference in that it's more cognitively perceivable? Because you realize that this is my plastic bag and this will end up in the turtle's stomach and it's me who is responsible for this and I can do something about it. So if we realize that maybe the plastic pollution discussion had a bigger impact than flying or climate change, how could we learn from this to make it more perceivable for people?
Yeah, I guess two things. I think indeed you're right. The visibility with plastic, it's much clearer or more obvious. Okay, if I reduce the amount of plastic I dispose of, there will be less plastic waste in the ocean, so it will be better. And of course, with climate change, it's more indirect, it's more in the long term, so it's less visible. But also maybe the consequences for you personally are different, right? Maybe reducing the amount of plastic that you use or dispose of, you can imagine that's still fine to live with, but giving up some things such as maybe your nice flights for a holiday or not using your car anymore, those may be also more costly things to give up. So I think on the one hand, what we can then learn is indeed if you make it more visible, more clearly what the consequences are, that could help. But of course, reducing the personal cost of changing your behavior, that's a bit more
difficult. But there again, I think policymakers can help also make these downsides for you personally less harsh, so to make the costs lower or to make it more pleasurable.
Yeah, but also, why could you still buy something that is so harmful? For instance, why plastics that would take about 150,000 years before they break down, or longer even? That shouldn't exist almost. Like that, there should be. No one wants to buy something that is so that might be so devastating to their environment.
Okay, well, I think we can definitely conclude by saying that it's a very complicated matter. And maybe you now know something about the ethical perspective that you can apply yourself, and maybe you can decide whether you should fly or not for yourself. But I would, I think we don't have time for anything else. But I would like to give all of you the opportunity to make a short final statement, or maybe a message to everyone here. And let's start with you.
Okay. So give me least time to think about it.
Good luck.
Good luck. Yeah. I'll try to stretch it out as long as
possible. It
possible.
doesn't have to be world-changing.
No, I think we covered most of the points that I wanted to make. In that there is an individual responsibility for people, but it's not just you, right? So I mean, yes, your actions can change something, but if you listen to people and they just say, yeah, but you don't respond to that, or you don't, you vote green, but you take a plane yourself, so you don't have any right to say something about it. I think that doesn't add up, right? So I think having a view of this bigger picture of the problems, but also potential solutions, is, I think, very important. And for me, I think that we have to cooperate to achieve that. This bigger picture, we can only solve it with bigger measurements. And you can't do that only by individual change. You can do that with individual change. I think individual change is necessary, but that's not the only solution.
Yeah, okay. And you?
I completely agree, but then if you want to promote individual change, I think what's keeping governments or organizations from actually implementing policies is sometimes that they're afraid that people will not support it. So therefore, how we can help is then, I think, also by showing that you are willing to bear some of these costs or to change your behavior. So to make that clear in any way you can.
Okay, and last but not least.
Well, I think it stays very important to keep track of what you are doing yourself and what you are consuming, especially because obviously flying is also about consumption, right? About having that experience and doing something you want to do. And really think about, what do I really need? Is this indeed, can I go to the picture that you showed? Can I go to Rijnland in Germany, or do I really need to see the Arizona or the Grand Canyon? Think about what you're doing, and at the one side, and really try to be conscious in that sense, and on the other hand, also dare to live and laugh a little, because we're only here in a very short notice of the cosmos. So some relativation or even moral nihilism is also important, I think, to stay in touch with yourself.
Okay, well, thank you very much. I hope you gained some new insights. I'd like to thank you all for agreeing to speak here. I have a little present for you. I just need to get it from there. Thank you for speaking.
Oh, wow, ticket to Berlin. Well, shouldn't have done that.
There you go.
You really shouldn't have done that.
Please don't.
And for you as well. And to all of you, thank you for coming here tonight. I hope you enjoyed it, and hopefully see you again next time. Thank you.